And I'm the Deputy General Manager for the Border Environment Cooperation Commission. And I actually have two questions. The BEC just finished the inventories and forecasts for the 6 Mexican states. And we found that energy generation in each of the states emitted anywhere between 30 and 37% of the GHG emissions. At the same time, anywhere between 25 and 30% of the GHG emissions were for energy consumption. Our work with the states for the next phase of these studies is to work with them on what actions they can take as a state to reduce their GHG emissions. So here's my question. Because the complaint we get from the Mexican states, how do you focus this effort so that the states feel some sort of empowerment in reducing GHG emissions in energy generation when it's something that's exclusively controlled by the Mexican federal government? That's my first question. My second question is, how do we refocus them, the states, to focus on GHG reduction techniques, which in my opinion, really are necessary in the public transportation sector, which in theory you get double the benefit, correct? So my question to the panelists is, trick question, but I'm very interested in hearing your perspective.
So what we are thinking is that probably the best way to advance climate protection action at local level is thinking more in terms of what communities are already doing in that areas, and how can you take those actions and put them within the framework of sustainable climate protection activities. I think that's the approach that may work better in the case of Mexico, and in many communities in the U.S. that are small and don't have the capacity, and probably that also is something that we need to tie again with the issue of developing local capacity for planning and policy making.
I'll try to answer the questions you raised, which are really hard. And I don't think the U.S. example would be particularly useful because of the centralized planning. In the U.S., the states do have control over the electricity. But what seems to be happening in some of the Mexican states is that there is more of an interaction between CFE and some local authorities than I've observed in the past. So for example, in Baja California, there's a state energy commission that exists now, and they are putting a 10 megawatt wind farm in conjunction with CFE. And my suggestion is that CFE is not this monolithic entity that cannot be influenced. In the northern parts of Mexico, as we heard from Gabriela's presentation, there are enormous resources for renewable energies. If those states where those resources exist can develop a plan so that CFE can exploit those resources in conjunction with, say, local economic development plans, you have an economic incentive for the region to begin to invest in those resources. I'm thinking solar, wind, and geothermal. This allows CFE to meet its mandate of providing power, but it also develops economic growth or economic development in the region itself. And there may be some synergies here. Paul Gantz and I were asked to meet with the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Carlos Pesquera, specifically what his office could do to encourage renewable energy in the Mexican northern region. And that is an opportunity then for you to exploit, to make that contact with him, and then let him use his office to suggest things to the Mexican or to the U.S. that could suggest to Mexico, and that will come back to CFE. But the bottom line is, I think you can convince people in CFE it's in their benefit to develop these sustainable resources. And the local authorities, from their perspective, it's viewed as an economic development issue. Those two things can work together. And one specific thing I would suggest you keep in mind is what in California is called a renewable portfolio standard. There's no reason why CFD couldn't have a renewable portfolio standard as well. And the charts that were shown suggest that the sector is, the wedge of the pie is growing. But CFD won't do it unless there's interest from the central government and the local state governments to suggest to them and to tell them this is something that's good for the country. And so that's one way to take this national entity and bring it down to the state level, which will deal with the issue. And just one more comment on Paul Rasmussen's point. He's absolutely right. For better or worse, well, for worse, the debate on climate change in an incredibly short period of time, less than a year, has dramatically shifted in the wrong direction. And I won't go into the reasons for that. It's, you all have your opinions, but I think it's an observation that that's the case. And so in my discussions about this, I link every chance I get climate change with air pollution and air quality. They are in fact almost identical. The pollutants that are reduced by doing appropriate things for greenhouse gas emissions inevitably reduce many of the ambient, many of the pollutants that are regulated by EPA, both in the US and Mexico, CO, NOx, and many of the other things. And when you take it down to health issues in the local community, people understand that. And then you can begin, you don't even have to talk about climate change. You can just have an energy efficient policy and a health issue related to air quality, and you'll accomplish almost the same thing as you would in terms of climate change. So that's one suggestion.